I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
And those who are most marginalized know the most about the truth, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Dean Detloff, a PhD student at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto.
I'm Matt Bernico, and I teach media studies at Greenville University in Greenville, Illinois.
This week, we decided to talk to Jim Hodgson, who you'll learn a lot more about in a moment, about the situation in Venezuela. It's a really complicated whole thing that's going on, as you can probably discern from seeing all kinds of different reporting and narratives about it right now. And we've had a lot of people ask us about it, and we did an episode on Chavismo a long time ago with a scholar named George Chicarella-Mar. I think it's episode 31. So you could learn more about the political philosophy, I guess, there at that episode. But we just wanted to take some time to talk to someone who's actually been to Venezuela. And Jim has been an election observer there in 2018 and also been a couple of other times during the Bolivarian Revolution. So we picked his brain to sort of learn a little bit about what he thinks about what's happening there and a little bit more about the context of everything that you're reading in the news.
Yeah, it's such a hard situation because everything you're reading in the news is, skewed and complicated. And there's so many, politics and different facets weighing on that media narrative, and that's something we'll talk to Jim a lot about too. But in case you want some other external resources from this podcast about the situation in Venezuela and maybe how this media narrative works, you should also check out a scholar named Alan McLeod. He wrote an article this past week that got published in a journal called Race and Class. So you can probably find a PDF of it floating around up there. And if you can't, I guess let me know and I'll send it to you or something. The article is called Chavista Thugs versus Opposition Civil Society, Western Media, and Venezuela.
He also, he's got a number of other articles which are great, but he also wrote a whole book that's just called Bad News from Venezuela. And it's all like media analysis of how people in the West narrate what's happened in Venezuela. So a really good scholar to kind of check out what he's up to.
Cool. Well, let's go to Jim.
This week on the Magnificast, we're talking to Jim Hodgson, the program coordinator for Latin America and the Caribbean for the United Church of Canada. Could you, Jim, maybe introduce yourself and tell us exactly what that means? What is that title, and what do you do with the United Church?
Yeah, thank you. It's good to be here with you. So for the past 19 years, I've worked with the National Office of the United Church of Canada. The United Church is Canada's largest Protestant church with about 3,000 congregations across the country. It's built from the union of Methodist, Presbyterian, and Congregational churches, and later several others, dating back about more than 90 years now. The church inherited mission relationships, kind of traditional mission relationships. They're a little bit colonial from the founding churches. But by the 1960s, we had moved to a different model, much more based on partnership, and not, old language of mother and daughter churches and things like that. So as churches became independent in developing countries, including independent of us, we try to establish much more equal relations of partnership. So what I do is support the United Church's partnerships with churches, theological education centers, and other kinds of organizations. So our partnerships aren't limited just to the religious kinds of organizations, but we also work with some women's groups, some indigenous groups, human rights organizations in different places. So I work now with about 30 organizations in about 8 countries in the region. At least those are the ones that we share funds with. There are other countries like Venezuela, in fact, that we don't have direct partnership relations in, but because of the way that people talk to each other or relate to each other, we're part of a broader ecumenical network of churches and organizations that have relationships with people in Venezuela. Oh, and you asked about me too. How did I get into this? My background is Catholic, and I came to this work out of some experiences I had first in the mid '80s in the Dominican Republic, Haiti, and Nicaragua. My background is also in journalism, so I began to make a career for myself in the intersection of journalism, church, and Latin America. And part of that was realizing that the churches would pay me to be in Latin America and write about Latin America, and not many other people would. So that's kind of how I got to do what I'm doing. And I also lived in the Dominican Republic for 2 years at the end of the 80s, and in Mexico for 6 years at the end of the 90s.
Cool. Well, speaking of those trips to Venezuela that the church was willing to pay you to go write about, that's pretty cool. Speaking of those trips, you went to Venezuela as a delegation of labor leaders and as a representative of the United Church of Canada to observe the 2018 presidential election, an election that now people are suddenly caring a lot more about. So a lot of stories in the media today characterize that election as illegitimate or unfair or something else altogether. What did you and the other observers see there? What did actual Venezuelans say? Do those characterizations that the media make match what you actually saw?
I think there's probably a couple of different ways of looking at this, and that might be helpful to people who are listening. One is that, I went as an observer. The United Church sent me. I went as part of a delegation organized by Common Frontiers, which is a coalition of organizations in Canada that probably most of which are labor organizations. So the Canadian Labour Congress, Unifor, the CUPE, public sector workers, and others. So Common Frontiers sent this delegation, and before we went, we were very clear we would go and observe and report. A lot of what I saw, I wrote about at the time for a blog section of rabble.ca, so you can look for the articles, not just mine, but those of other people, by typing in Google rabble.ca Venezuela. They'll pop up right away. So what we saw was a really well-run election. This was, I believe, the 25th election since 1998, when Hugo Chavez won election the first time as president of Venezuela. So 25 elections in 20 years. They've gotten pretty good at doing this. What's controversial is that some parts of the opposition boycotted the election, and so we need to go back a little bit and to understand why. So there had been a National Assembly election, I think in 2016, that the opposition actually won, or the more representatives of opposition parties won that election. They created obviously an issue for the executive part of the government. There are actually 5 branches in the Venezuelan state, and I can't go through them all, but in a usual Republican form of government, you have 3 branches. So one of them is legislative, one of them is the executive, one of them is judicial, and then there's something about the sort of the authority of people and organizations. So anyway, the National Assembly election was won by the opposition. The government's response to that was to say, look, our constitution needs to be rethought 20 years into the Bolivarian Revolution, and we're going to call a Constituent Assembly. So a Constituent Assembly was elected, and the Constituent Assembly has the task of drawing up a new constitution. As such, it was given the right to kind of have authority over the other branches of the government during the time that it takes to create a new constitution. I think questions can be asked and debate can be held, but that is the decision of the Venezuelan people to do things that way. So the National Assembly continued to exist, and it had a revolving, like each of the parties each of the opposition parties that have together a majority had kind of alternating presidencies, and so this guy that has been chosen by the government of Canada and the government of the United States to supposedly be the president of Venezuela was to be kind of the interim president or chair or speaker of the National Assembly. And so he won a seat in the National Assembly, but wasn't elected to anything more than that by the people of Venezuela. And so suddenly now he's this sort of designated opposition president. That is controversial. So one other thing to keep in mind in that debate over National Assembly, Constituent Assembly, powers of different branches of government and all of that was that after the National Assembly election and then after the creation of the Constituent Assembly, the government of Venezuela sat down in a negotiation with the opposition parties. And this was hosted by the government of the Dominican Republic in Santo Domingo, but it had accompaniment from a number of former heads of government or heads of state, including Zapatero from Spain and several others. And so they worked hard and got to some initial agreements, and the Venezuelan government agreed to move the presidential election date ahead from December 2018 to May 2018, and made that official and so on. But then at the very last minute, once an agreement was on the table, the opposition walked away from the negotiations and said no, they wouldn't agree. They wouldn't agree to what they had agreed to. They wouldn't formalize the agreement. So that, to me, is that fact that there were negotiations before that the opposition walked away from seems to get lost in a lot of the media coverage. And I mean, all of that happened after the National Assembly election and after the creation of the Constituent Assembly. So the fuss right now about that election in May being illegitimate and unfair just seems to me unfair, unjust. We saw a fair election that some of the opposition parties boycotted, but some of the opposition parties participated in. 48% of the population participated in the vote. Maduro won it. I've forgotten by what proportion, but a substantial proportion, and on we've gone. And there was, the rest of 2018 was fairly quiet in Venezuela. There weren't too many protests, but all of a sudden now in January, there's this new initiative by the so-called Lima group to not recognize the elections, and to declare this other man the supposed president of Venezuela.
Thanks for that really condensed and compressed history. There's a lot of really good touch points there, Jim. And I want to get us up to speed to more contemporary events soon. But I think it's probably helpful for us to spend a little bit more time also investigating your own trip to Venezuela for that particular election. So right before the election, the Venezuelan opposition, they asked the United Nations not to send observers to the election, so that it wouldn't, on their perspective, sort of legitimize what they said was a rigged poll. But you and these other folks with Common Frontiers thought that it was important to show up anyhow. Why was it important to go independently? And also, why was it important to go on the behalf of the church? Why would the United Church have an interest in sort of observing those elections and having something to say about them?
Thanks. I think maybe I'll go to the church part first. What's been important to us about Venezuela is that it's another one of those experiments, if you will, of of people who've been traditionally locked out of power, the poor majority, the people who never benefited from Venezuela's oil wealth. Suddenly they got power. It was a bit of an accident in 1998. I think Chavez won that election and maybe was surprised himself, and then it took a few years to sort of figure out what to do with the power and how to proceed. Meanwhile, the opposition got organized and tried all kinds of things to try to unseat Chavez, just as they've tried to unseat Maduro in more recent years. So the question for us is always, well, having won power, what do the poor have to do to be able to hold on to power? Traditionally in Latin America, there's been a kind of a facade of democracy, a formal democracy. So people vote, but things stay pretty much the same. Historically in Latin America, you had liberal parties and conservative parties, a bit like Canada, and they traded power off between them every 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, whatever. But nothing changed. Nothing fundamentally changed, and the differences were about the relative power of rural landowners as opposed to urban business owners. You still see that play out in places like Guatemala or Colombia, so for a socialist party or a social democratic party even to win, take power, begin to make change, to begin to do, in fact, what it is we say in our theology, take the powerful from their thrones in the Magnificat and replace them with a different kind of power, obviously threatens the powers that be. So we've watched the process in Venezuela the way we have the processes in Bolivia with the changes there and a few other places, the so-called pink wave over the past decade, Lula in Brazil and so on, with a lot of interest, because it was the first time in a very long time that we saw politicians put social goals ahead of kind of narrowly defined GDP or economic goals. So I had gone to Venezuela before. I went in 2004 as an observer of the recall referendum that was used to try to unseat Chavez. And Chavez won that referendum with 60% of the vote. And then I went again two years later. One of the problems in the whole situation with Venezuela is how Venezuela and Colombia kind of get played against each other, or different sectors in each society get played against each other. And so in 2006, we did some work together with base Christian communities in Colombia and some grassroots movements and churches in Venezuela to try to bring together a conversation about what kind of relationship could exist between the people of the two countries, and especially the church people. So I think that's why I wanted to go back again in 2018 as an observer was to sort of say we want to hold faith with the people of Venezuela in their journey, in their struggle to make change real. it's not to discount party democracy, but it is to say that the traditional party democracy gives a lot of power to those people who have a lot of money and a lot of influence over media. And can something different be done that respects the poor majority? The poor people are the majority in every one of the countries that we're talking about, but they rarely win the vote. And so one of the things I've often thought about Venezuela and about Nicaragua more recently too is that until the opposition parties come up with a platform that respects the interests of poor people, they won't win elections that are truly free and fair. So a truly free and fair election will elect the poor or their representatives to power. And what we usually see are elections that kind of alternate power amongst the powerful and the rich, rather than the actual majority population in the countries of Latin America.
That's a really interesting way to put it, I think. I like that idea that, if democracy is about the rule of the people and the rule of the majority, then if it's the case that the poor are the majority, why are they so often kept out of power? That's a pretty provocative idea, I think.
Yeah, and I think that you can see some people with good intentions here trying to restrict the power of money in elections, and this goes back and forth a bit. The big powerful U.S. think tanks and money interests and the Fraser Institute in Canada hate that idea that the power of money should be restricted. They see it as an unfair restriction on their power. But from my perspective, and I think from the perspective of people who really care about democracy in its people rule sense, need to see the damage that money can do to democracy. And I think what's going on in the United States right now is an example of that.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, I guess on that point, I don't want to focus on the May elections completely, but I do want to, I guess, maybe riff off of what you just said here a bit. The way that journalists and media outlets talk about the May elections, it seems like there's actually a lot at stake. We might get the feeling that there's more at stake than just just the election itself, or just the leader of the country for a time. So on that point about democracy and money in politics, is the May election that have been contested, is there something bigger going on there? Is there something that makes them more important than the election of another company or another country?
It's kind of odd to me that the election suddenly, or the validity of the election suddenly is so contested, because in May last year, the opposition boycotted. Canada prevented Venezuelans in Canada from voting in Venezuelan consulates. That was seen in Venezuela as a hostile act. That was one of the controversies while we were there. Why is Canada so hostile to Venezuela was a question people asked. And I don't. To me, it doesn't really make sense, except that that the election was again one of those tests of. To use a certain phrase, popular power. The election represented another opportunity by the people of Venezuela to affirm the direction the government was taking, or that the people were taking, that the country was taking. There were opposition candidates. There was freedom to vote. The vote was secret. It was. There were, checks and balances built into the system to ensure that it was secret and that the counting was fair. And goodness, it was a bit controversial at the time, but it's much more controversial all of a sudden now in January 2019. So then you have to kind of go back and think, well, what else is going on? And there's a whole I think there's a whole design. I don't want to be like a conspiracy theorist about it all, but I think there's kind of been plans unleashed since the emergence of that pink wave in Latin America to try to unseat the progressive governments, the governments that wanted to set social goals ahead of narrow economic goals. So in Paraguay and in Brazil, they used kind of questionable parliamentary techniques to get the progressives out of power. In Honduras, it was an outright coup. In Argentina and Chile, they were able to use just the regular political system to unseat the powerful. In Mexico, things have turned out a bit differently. A party of the left won the last election, and I think it's because people saw the absolute exhaustion, the moral bankruptcy of the traditional parties, the sort of centrist PRI and the conservative PAN, and that neither of them had been able to deal with the real problems of Mexico. So the people voted for a party that hadn't been in power and that might actually produce some change. And the people who have been able to upset or overturn the progressive governments in other places didn't have time to organize against that. So who am I talking about? Well, a number of times when I've been an election observer in other places, including Haiti or Mexico in 2000, you find yourself standing in front of a polling station and with other foreign observers. And, who are you here with? Oh, I'm from the National Endowment for Democracy, or I'm with the National Democratic Institute, or the International Republican Institute, or the name close to that, but that's not quite the right name. But so the United States has this thing called the National Endowment for Democracy, which is supposed to be about funding to promote democracy in other countries, which all sounds fine, except that there's a certain take on what democracy is. And it goes back to what I was saying before about the power of rich people. They'll promote democracy, but as long as it keeps countries safe for capitalism and safe for rich people and keeps the oil interests in the hands of the people who will benefit most from them, and so on. So in Venezuela or in Haiti or in Nicaragua now, you can see the fingerprints of the National Endowment for Democracy in a lot of the action. So there's a good article floating about just now by Max Blumenthal and someone else, Jay Cohen, I think, about the way that this guy Guaido, the supposed interim president of Venezuela, how he was trained by the National Endowment for Democracy for the job that the powers outside of Venezuela want him to do. So I would just encourage your listeners, I guess, to type National Endowment for Democracy into their search engine and read about it. It's not hard to follow their fingerprints on how conservative opposition movements are funded by U.S. interests.
Yeah, I mean, I get the apprehension to sound too conspiratorial, but there is a sense in which there's a certain kind of, maybe not conspiracy, but certainly organized vested interests in what happens in Latin America. And that's something that seems to be sort of emerging around this particular coup attempt in Venezuela. I guess we can return to what's going on there now on the ground a little bit more in a second, but could you say something too about sort of Canada and the US's role in what's happening in Venezuela now? For example, I've just been thinking about how Canada appears to be a pretty major player in this coup attempt, which might kind of be surprising for people who think of Canada as like a polite society where the joke is that everybody sort of says sorry all the time, or holds the door open for everybody. But you've been following Canadian intervention in other places like Haiti and elsewhere. So what role has Canada taken in Venezuela, and how does that sort of match up with U.S. Interests and that sort of thing? Maybe you could just kind of speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, thanks. I think some of us are a bit surprised by the Canadian attitude around Venezuela, and I would compare it to other moments in history. So Canada and Mexico were the only two countries in the Americas that did not break relations with Cuba after the revolution in 1959. That for many years, I think, was a sign of pride for Canadians that we took a stance that was independent of that of the United States. In the Central American wars, there were times when Canada would refuse to criticize the United States. Trudeau had a foreign minister, a guy named Mark McGuigan, who got into this bizarre debate about whether Canada's attitude towards the war in El Salvador was quiescent or acquiescent. And I still don't remember what the point was, but I can remember it being a big deal at the time. But in any case, Canada was like not really engaging on one side or the other, but by not engaging, it seemed like they were too close to the U.S., that kind of thing. But at another moment, I think during the Mulroney years, in the 1980s, Joe Clark, the foreign minister, is that right? Yeah, Joe Clark, the foreign minister, supported what was called the Contadora peace process. So this was a process to get towards negotiations around the various Central American conflicts. So Canada, in that instance, supported dialogue over the U.S. strategy, which was war. And so you come to right now. Well, we're 25 years into a globalized neoliberal economy, free trade agreements, trade protection, and so on. And so, yeah, the sands have shifted. So some of us kind of want to go straight to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Chrystia Freeland, and blame her. And I'm kind of tempted to do that too. She has a kind of an attitude towards the left that I don't think is fair. And she does also have an argument that is about authoritarianism, and so she doesn't like authoritarian governments, she says. And in that speech in Washington last year, kind of at the height of the new NAFTA or no NAFTA with Trump, she made a speech in Washington where she talked about authoritarianism and this defense of the post-war system of multilateral institutions, the United Nations and its agencies and World Bank and all of that. In a way you can say, yeah, well, that's fine. But then to take aim at Venezuela, I think is a mistake. But it's not just Freeland. It's, when I've talked with Canadian diplomats, and this goes back, I'd say maybe about 10 years, during the Harper years as well as the more recent past. And there was tremendous hostility towards the Venezuelan government, and it is hard to understand why. Why is it so awful that a government tries to turn the resources of the nature towards the benefit of the poor, for healthcare, for education? Why is it so awful that a government acts in solidarity with poor people in other countries and begins to trade things like oil for doctors, in the case of Cuba, or other kinds of resources in other countries, or even sells oil at a reduced price to countries like Haiti, in fact? Those to me are all good things, and I don't see why the Canadian government would oppose them, except that there's a lot of power in Canada in oil companies and in mining companies. And I kind of think that the oil companies and the mining companies have really got a hold now on the way Canadian foreign policy is conducted. that and is probably the more immediate issue is not wanting to offend Trump any more than possible. And that might be why we're kind of playing this game over China, why we're playing this game around Venezuela. But I do think it goes deeper than that. That it probably has something to do with the interests of the resource extraction industry in Canada and what they see in Venezuela, which is a lot of oil, coltan, gold, and other resources.
So speaking of that authoritarianism you just mentioned a minute ago, I mean, that is the sort of main media narrative that's emerged around Maduro. It's, I guess not just Maduro as well. It's kind of like there's a sort of negative light that has been put onto the entire legacy of Chavismo by both Canada and the United States. So could you maybe say a little bit more about that, like the claims of authoritarianism, or just like the claim that Maduro is a dictator or something? Is there anything there, or like what do you think the purpose of that specific narrative is?
Yeah. To me, it's hard to understand because I don't really believe it. I think that there are all kinds of ways that opposition voices are heard and are effective in Venezuela. There are municipalities and state governments as well as the national government, and many of the municipalities or states are controlled by opposition parties. Much of the media is still independent of the government. They say and do pretty freely what they want. So it's not. There's not the same social control that I can remember in some other places, and I've sometimes thought about the governments of the left, that they could be more open to individual voices and writers and artists and different ways of thinking. But I don't even think that that's been a problem in Venezuela. It's Venezuela clamped down hard on one of the big opposition television networks. It refused to renew its license. But that was a television network where, honestly, you would sit down in the morning and watch breakfast television, and they would be there talking about how to assassinate the president. I mean, it really went beyond the pale. It would be not permissible in Canada to sit on television and talk about how to assassinate the leader of the government. It's just preposterous. So is that authoritarianism? No, it's protection of the public interest, it seems to me. And it would be seen that way in Canada too. So I think a lot of this stuff about Venezuela being authoritarian is just made up. I don't see the evidence for it.
Just to kind of keep on a similar line, but maybe from like the opposite angle or opposite side. Okay, so there's one narrative about Venezuela that says Maduro is this authoritarian consolidating all his power. And then on the other hand, or on the other sort of side of society, people are getting poorer and poorer. And one sort of story that gets told a lot in the news media is that, all Venezuelans want Maduro out, and he's just clinging to it, as hard as he can. So, what do you say to people who kind of are otherwise maybe informed media consumers? They're reading what should be reputable news sources. And the story that they get is that there's all this social unrest because of someone like Maduro. And if you would only listen to Venezuelans, you would know the truth, which is that Maduro is this dictator kind of ruining everyone's lives and getting fat off of his own oil or something like that. How would you kind of re-narrate that story?
I think maybe two things. One is about the impact of sanctions. So for the past several years, Venezuela has been facing these sanctions from the United States and some other countries. So just the existence of a sanctions regime has put a bit of a scare into companies that might be willing to sell food or pharmaceuticals to Venezuela. So there have been shortages of all kinds of things in Venezuela. so the impact of sanctions does have an impact that hurts people. There are ways that Venezuela is getting access to a lot of medication from India, and food and consumer goods. Some things do get there. We when I was there in May, we tried to go for a walk around the center of the city and into pharmacies and into supermarkets, and we certainly were experienced with restaurants and cafes and whatnot, and didn't have trouble finding what it was we needed. As kind of foreigners wandering around in downtown Caracas. So, but I think for ordinary people, it can be a challenge, and so the government has ways of assuring basic food supplies to people with subsidized rates. But yeah, the sanctions have had an impact. And I've forgotten the other thing I was going to say about this, but media. How the story gets told. I've been surprised by the tone of the CBC these past few weeks in Canada. And I think it goes back to how journalists work together with each other. So a network like, the U.S. networks, any of them, or CBC, relies on networks of translators and freelancers, and those people have to be bilingual, and so they're coming from a certain class in Venezuela, or maybe they come out of a space where they've been working for that network that lost its license, and maybe their best friend does or did, and so there's, or maybe they depend on a network like CNN in Spanish, CNN in Español, or Univision for their major income. So they're not going to do anything that upsets the boat with their major employer. So you get a certain discourse going on among journalists, and for anybody who's independent of that, it's pretty hard to one, get hired, and two, get your voice out and get heard. So there are other spaces, Telesur, which is a network sponsored by the Venezuelan government, based in Ecuador. So Telesur has a service in English as well as its major service in Spanish. So it's a good alternative source. So I have my Facebook set up every morning so that I get the Telesur in English service first, and it kind of sets the tone for my day. I read other things. I pay a lot of attention to the CBC. I read the Globe and Mail every day, which is fairly conservative mainstream newspaper. So and somehow from all of that, I try to discern what might be true in a kind of provisional way every day. But from all of that, I have become very suspicious of the mainstream sources. The CBC the past couple of days has been using a new, very young freelancer in Caracas who, I don't know where he comes from, but he's repeating what they want to hear, and that's unfortunate. That's not good for journalism. That's not good for us as we try to determine policy. We need to hear more voices. I come back to. I'm offering a certain critique of media, but I come back to the point. Like, you can disagree with Chavez, you can think he's authoritarian, but how do you then propose to get out of the mess? If you accept that it's a mess, and I think that dialogue is the better way forward, not this kind of juvenile invention of a president. That's just not reasonable approach to serious problems.
Yeah, your explanation of the situation in terms of journalism, I think, is really helpful in highlighting, I guess, where some of these impasses come from. I mean, it's to me so wild that these media narratives completely shape the way that, you know, every single person thinks about the situation too, and that's how it's all mediated to us, is through these sometimes, you know, or usually pretty biased reporting. I mean, I saw Dean tweet earlier today about Venezuela, and like within seconds, some, you know, complete stranger was already jumping down his throat about how wrong he was or whatever. So it's just kind of like sets the tone of the whole situation. But I mean, for that very reason, that that the reporting is so complicated and biased, and you know, tending toward a specific reading of the situation, I think that your experience in Venezuela seems, you know, extremely relevant. So, I mean, you've traveled to other countries in Latin America and the Caribbean that have also been affected by imperialism of both Canada and the US. But Christians in imperialist countries often go to these other countries like on mission trips, and our experiences of them are mediated through both, you know, journalism, but also through the lens of, you know, evangelicalism. You know, where we go there to do certain types of humanitarian aid or some type of like spiritual development for the people there or something. Well, so, I mean, I guess in light of those other experiences that maybe weigh on people's minds and imaginations about Latin and Central America and the Caribbean, what do you think about the role of Christians in the U.S. and Canada when it comes to countries that have been, you know, profoundly shaped and affected by the policies of imperialist countries?
Yeah, thanks. I'll tell a bit about my own story and then share some thoughts. So when I went to the Dominican Republic first in 1983, I went in a program that was co-sponsored by Scarborough Foreign Missions, which was a Roman Catholic religious order that had missionaries first in China until the revolution in 1949, and then various other parts of the world. By the 1960s, most of their priests were kind of captivated or enchanted by liberation theology, and saw that made sense to them in their contexts, that they wanted to make an option for the poor. They wanted to stand with the poor in their aspirations, and so the Scarborough Missions had priests in the Dominican Republic, and they had priests there in 1965 when the United States invaded to put down a popular revolution that wanted to bring back a man named Juan Bosch, who had been overthrown in a coup sponsored by the Kennedy administration. We think of Kennedy as a good guy. Not always. Kennedy's government overthrew Juan Bosch in 1963. 1965, the people rebelled. There was a revolution, and one of the Scarborough priests who asked questions about political prisoners was murdered. So the Scarborough priests and a youth ministry of the Toronto Archdiocese here called Youth Corps at the time, it created this youth exposure visit, but it wasn't a week-long or a 10-day program of going and building a wall or a school or something. It was 6 weeks, and the whole intention was to go and listen and learn and engage in conversation. And so I went and was in an area where people were. There were many Haitian migrant workers who were cutting sugar cane. So I spoke French better than Spanish at the time, and I hung out with the Haitians. Learned about Haiti, met some of the popular educators and the activists who were trying to overcome the Duvalier dictatorship at the time. That all changed my life. That was absolutely transformative. It was 6 solid weeks of learning. But a lot of these mission trips that happen now are too short. They're week-long, 10 days. They're very programmed. The conversations, to the extent that they happen with the local people, tend to be facilitated, guided, or very controlled, and you don't get at the depth of the issues around, say, you're in Guatemala, well, you're indigenous, well, why has there never been an indigenous president of Guatemala? Why is it that 70% of the people are indigenous and none of your politicians look like you? How can you have those conversations when you're so focused on building a wall or a school or a clinic? Not that those are bad things, but there could be so much more that's done. So in the United Church anyway, yeah, we have groups that go to other countries and sometimes on short trips, but we put a strong emphasis on education. And hopefully people come back having learned something about the context that they're going into. It's, a problem for us right now in Nicaragua that, we had two pretty good ways of sending people to Nicaragua where, education was a focus. But if I found kind of after the disturbances last year, the protests, that people split along class lines. And we realized that the people who were doing the translating in those programs were kind of middle or upper class, and they had different interests from the people that we were sending our groups to. And I haven't figured my way out of that yet. But, who learns languages? Who has the time to learn languages? It's not necessarily you're not necessarily talking with the people you need to be talking with to have a transformative experience. So I think we all have to rethink how we do those kinds of programs, and maybe going back to the root of inspiration for me in the Dominican Republic and the way we did that program is a way to go.
These are all really amazing suggestions. We could talk for a whole hour, I think, about how to sort of bring a more anti-imperialist kind of sensibility to the way we do missions. I guess maybe we could kind of close just asking, as Christians are facing massive media campaigns to support coups, but also our own class interests that might kind of blind us to exactly those kinds of questions, like who learns languages and that sort of a thing. How do you think that Christians can talk with each other, with our friends or congregants or comrades who are not Christians, in a way that actually does justice to situations like Venezuela's or a number of others? Like, what are some practices maybe that you've found in the United Church to be really effective, or that you'd like to see more of, or do you have any kind of intuitions along those lines?
Well, thanks. It's a challenge, I think, every day, and we're living in times where opinions are polarized. And I'm part of that. I tend to view things from the left, the political and religious left, and so sometimes I'm tempted to just jump into the fight and start arguing, and sometimes that's necessary. But I actually try to take a deep breath and engage people in conversation. I think around Venezuela or Nicaragua, for that matter, right now, because those are a bit more in the news, getting into conversations about different approaches, different policy approaches. So promoting dialogue, support for dialogue, for people who are kind of in a sort of a middle ground, or, in that world of Canadian politics, which you can kind of have civilized discourse, at least from the NDP through the Liberals to the Red Tories, the sort of moderate Conservatives. You can kind of have reasonable conversations about the need for dialogue. With the hardliners, they're working out of they're working with alternate facts, or what they think are facts, and with other interests in mind, and so sometimes I have to find ways of encouraging them to think of things in just different ways, but that's much harder. That's a much bigger topic than trying to get to a more reasonable position for Canada with regard to Venezuela. I think the government should look hard at its history, the way it engaged with Cuba for many years, the way it engaged with Nicaragua right away after the revolution in 1979, establishing development programs and so on. I think more can be gained from engaging with progressive governments in other contexts than by going down this road of confrontation.
Yeah, thanks. That's really helpful. Well, Well, thanks so much for taking the time to talk with us. We'll try to we'll link some of the things that you mentioned, especially the Rabble articles and others where you did some more writing on this for folks to do some more research on their own. But yeah, we just wanted to say thanks so much for your time and for sharing some of your experience and some of your thoughts about these matters. It's really tough to kind of cut through all the fog of different interests. Hope that people kind of have another perspective.
Thanks. It's been good to talk with both of you, and I wish your listeners all the best as they discern their next steps. It's not that we have to agree on everything every day, but read widely, question each other. Look for other sources. Actually, I was going to say that Common Frontiers, the organization that organized our delegation, had put out a really good election report, and that's available online as well.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon, patreon.com/the Magnificast. You know what? We got some new stickers up there. We got this cool August Spies sticker. We got a very good sticker. It just says very good because our podcast is very good. Yeah, I actually got it this week, and it's on my laptop, and I love it. It's so good. It's very good. What can I say? Yeah. So do that. You can follow us on Twitter. Follow us on Facebook, I guess. We're there. I'm off Facebook these days. But if you're on there, talk to Dean and the other people, I guess.
Yeah, the Facebook group is still active, but I think the page has slowly escaped into the oblivion of abandoned Facebook pages.
Yeah, I mean, fair enough.
Just taking up space on Zuckerberg's servers.
That's right. That's the it's occupying the space. Cool. Well, thanks to Amari Armstrong for the intro music. That is still very good. Like our sticker again. And thanks to the Illogical Spoon for our outro music. Cool. We'll see you next time.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside.